All right, so welcome to another weekly class. Last time I talked about the concept of inflammation and how this was sort of a metaphorical or cultural concept based on people looking at the element of fire and finding something analogous to it in the human body, which was a set of features that go together: heat and pain and redness and swelling. So this week, I'm going to be talking about a somewhat related concept, a somewhat similar concept called stagnation. And stagnation does not really form part of the conventional medicine description of physiology and anatomy anymore, the way that inflammation still does. Conventional medicine doesn't really use the term stagnation anymore, the way it still uses the term inflammation. But the concept is still there in various different forms. So we've got this other concept, stagnation, which is sort of, whereas inflammation was based on the idea of fire, stagnation is based more on the idea of water. And so people looked at what water does when it's not flowing, and they saw that as analogous to certain things that happen in the human body when things aren't moving that should be moving. Basically you get stagnation when there's fluid in the body that isn't moving the way it should be. And in some traditions, this is just kind of described as stagnation. Some systems, like traditional Chinese medicine, get more specific about different kinds of stagnation. Like, for example, they would have blood stagnation, fluid stagnation, food stagnation, cold stagnation, which are all about different varieties of the same kind of thing, all about different forms of fluid not moving in the body when it ought to be. So what does stagnation look like? It can look like there can be swelling, stiffness, particularly a type of swelling we call edema, which is when things look puffy, not necessarily inflamed, but enlarged. Skin often gets shiny. Sometimes when you press on it, it will leave a pit behind. That is caused by fluid not moving, which is especially the lymph not moving, and that's considered a form of stagnation. Bad circulation would also be considered a form of stagnation, and that looks different. It's, for example, maybe you would get a darker color in the limbs, like your hands might turn more purplish or just dark, or maybe even a dark black color if it was very bad circulation. And that would be perhaps considered blood stagnation or just a lack of circulation. Paleness can also be a lack of circulation. The dark color tends to be more when blood's flowing into a part but not back out of it. There can be a pallor, a paleness when no blood is flowing into the limbs in the first place, which happens under certain circumstances. And so stagnation can be caused by inflammation. Stagnation can be caused because inflammation is not letting fluid circulate into an area, be it blood or lymph, or in the case of food, food stagnation is basically like constipation or just a lack of movement along the digestive tract. So normally you take in food by your mouth, swallow it, and it just kind of keeps moving and is pushed along by a wave-like movement of the muscles along the digestive tract, which is called peristalsis. And when peristalsis stops, that's stagnation of a different sort. That's food stagnation. And that can be further up in the stomach, in which case you might get nausea. It can be further down in the bowels, in which case you might get constipation, or just slower, less frequent bowel movements, for instance. So that's another form of stagnation. And that can be, and very often is, caused by inflammation that's keeping things from this, making some swelling that's causing an obstruction. So stagnation is often the result of some sort of an obstruction, and the obstruction may or may not be a type of inflammation. A lot of the time, what we see in something you see a lot of in middle-aged people in developed countries is that you get bad circulation in the lower limbs just because people spend a lot of time sitting at desk jobs and things like that, or sitting and watching TV when they get home from their desk job. And so that there's maybe stagnation that's resulting from just a positional thing where the person is not moving around, and maybe the way that they're sitting is putting pressure on the blood vessels that go in and out of their lower extremities. And so you get a lack of circulation. So sometimes it's a positional thing like that. Sometimes it can be a matter of just gravity. If somebody's heart and kidneys are not strong enough or not regulating fluid well enough, you'll get swelling in the lower extremities that's just fluid pooling there as a result of gravity. Sometimes if someone's blood vessels are not strong enough, you get the same sort of thing, and that can be helped by nourishing the blood vessels. So stagnation happens for a variety of different purposes, but in almost all cases, there's some sort of fluid that is not moving the way that it should be in the body. In some of the traditional Chinese medicine definitions of stagnation, there's not exactly a bodily fluid involved, because some of it is qi stagnation, which is more energetic, but I'm not going to really get into that so much because it's not really a form that I feel like I am the best qualified person to talk about. I have a working understanding of traditional Chinese medicine, but I'm not an expert on it. And there are lots of other people out there who can tell you more about that if you want to seek that information out. But generally speaking, stagnation involves some kind of a fluid that should be flowing but isn't somewhere in the body. And like I said, that can happen for a variety of different reasons. Just a second. So I've had a question of what kind of a stagnation would be involved if there was a tick bite or a spider bite or something like that, an envenomation. And there's inflammation, and as a result of the inflammation, there can be stagnation of blood and of lymph because of the way that the inflammation is sort of isolating that area from the rest of the body. And that can cause, there can be decay while that's going on, which is kind of one of the things that happens with stagnation, wherever it is in the body. And for whatever reason, is that there tends to be a lack of nutrients circulating, because the fluids that move through our body move nutrients around and they move waste products around, right? So if your blood isn't flowing, then your cells aren't going to get oxygen. They're not going to get sugar. They're not going to have respiration and be able to create energy, and they're going to die. And so if someone's has bad enough stagnation in their limbs, especially of the sort that might happen from frostbite or from something being very extremely constricted or whatever, you can get something like gangrene, where the stagnation is so bad that it leads to dying of tissue, of necrosis, which is just when part of the body dies and starts to decay. And that's a really extreme and kind of gnarly outcome. Some other things that can happen as a result of stagnation would include changes in the quality of tissue. For instance, if someone has very poor circulation to their legs, they've got a lot of blood stagnation happening in their lower extremities, they might have some atrophy of the muscles there. It's not necessarily, it's a similar process in a way to what happens with necrosis, but it's a very slow and controlled version of that, where tissue is wasting away but not being immediately destroyed or quickly destroyed. So you don't get infection, and you don't get like rotting tissue or anything really gross like that. You just get, muscles getting weaker, for instance. You also get lack of nerve function. And you can get some transient lack of nerve function pretty quickly. You know, if you wear a wristband that's too tight, you'll start to lose feeling in your hand after several minutes. But if you take it off, that will come back. Now, if you were to leave something on that like that on for a really long time, you might get some permanent damage. You might get some permanent nerve damage from having lack of nutrients flowing through that part of your body and taking care of the substances, the tissues that are there. You can also get deposition of harmful substances. And the most famous example of that would be gout. Gout is a type of arthritis that results from toxins being deposited in the joints, particularly crystals of acid that are a waste product of metabolism, get deposited in the joints, especially the joints of the toes, but it can happen anywhere if it gets bad enough. And this tends to be related to stagnation. It's made worse by cold. It's made worse by taking in more of the substances that produce these metabolites, that produce these waste products. And it's sometimes made worse by factors related to age, like weaker kidneys and a weaker heart. And it can be very painful. And the way that you deal with it is similar to the way that you deal with all inflammation, which is that you try and increase circulation to the affected areas. So how do we increase circulation and move stagnation? This is a big challenge. This is a big part of what you need to be able to do if you're going to be someone who heals people with natural substances. Really with any substances, although, you know, like I said, outside of the world of traditional medicine, outside of herbal medicine and certain traditional healing systems, people might not use the term stagnation. So it's a cultural construct in terms of what we categorize as stagnation. But making fluids move when they need to move and dealing with it when fluids are not moving the way that they should be is really important to maintaining health and to helping other people to maintain their health. So there are a few things that you can do, a few basic strategies that a lot of different things fall into. One of them is agitating that area of the body. This can be rubbing, shaking, it can be moving through exercise. Over the years, there have been various treatments that used vibration or electric shock. Electric shock has its own set of drawbacks. Vibration is pretty much safe. But when people started getting mechanical in the late 1800s, there were a lot of weird treatments that involved those sorts of things. But just agitating, physically, mechanically agitating the area, especially rubbing, shaking, squeezing, that sort of thing, can often cause fluids to move. And so that's a good thing to know. Another way that you can deal with it is just by, and this is kind of a subcategory of agitating, but of using physical movements to get the fluids in the body to move, is by changing position. If someone's got fluid pooling in their feet, if they've got stagnation of fluids that are moving into their lower extremities, elevating those extremities can help a lot. This is something that if you do a lot of long distance hiking or mountaineering, sometimes you're taught to do this as just, you know, lay down and elevate your feet above the level of your heart and allow gravity to just draw some of the fluids in those parts out of those parts. And so that's something that you can do. Massage is a whole realm of healing unto itself, but a lot of what it's doing is moving stagnation. That's a big part of what massage has to offer is moving fluids in the body, increasing circulation, moving the lymph, things like that. Massage on the abdomen for people with bad peristalsis, for people whose food isn't moving in their digestive tract, can be really helpful. Two techniques that a lot of people use with their children if they're having constipation. but you can use it with other people too. You can use it on yourself even. One of them is rubbing around the navel in a clockwise direction, just gently moving the hand around, pressing down a little bit, not applying a whole lot of pressure, but just gently rubbing around the navel in a clockwise direction can help to move the stagnation in the lower digestive tract. Another thing that can help with that is just finding the ooh, hi, sorry about that. Hmm? Sorry about that. My device died even though it was plugged in. So hopefully it won't do that again. It shows that it's taking a charge, but I don't know what happened exactly. That was unexpected. So I was saying that the floating ribs, the first floating rib, which is right below the rib cage, it sticks out and doesn't attach to anything. It's just sort of a pointy rib on either side. But putting gentle pressure on the tip of that rib is a way that you can move stagnation in the digestive system. It's just a point that you can gently hold, and it's attached to the sort of connective tissue that holds all your uh, organs together. And so just gently holding that can help things to move. So that's another technique, and another way of, and really probably when possible, the best way of agitating fluids in the body is just standing up and walking around, taking a walk, even if it's a few dozen steps. Sometimes it can make a big difference to things like circulation, constipation, other forms of stagnation in the body. So that's a good thing for you to know about. Another very simple technique that you can use for helping to move stagnation is water externally. Water internally is helpful too, because it creates fluid and it softens things up. So sometimes that's really what's needed. Making sure that somebody is not dehydrated is vital to dealing with any kind of stagnation. But having somebody get in warm water will often help fluids in their bodies to move. Sometimes using hot compresses, putting heat on something with, say, a hot, moist towel wrapped around the leg or the arm or something like that, if there's not circulation happening in those areas, that can be a really good way of moving that stagnation. Some traditions consider fever to be a form of stagnation, and fever, one of the least convenient but pretty effective ways of dealing with fever is wrapping somebody in a wet sheet and allowing the evaporation from that wet sheet to take the heat with it as it evaporates from the heat of their body. It just, the heat of their body starts evaporating the water, and the evaporating water takes away the heat. And that's a drug-free and very powerful and kind of sometimes too dramatic way of dealing with a fever that's too high. You don't want to do it for long, because the person starts to feel cold and they can kind of, it can be a little bit like giving them hypothermia because their body temperature drops. So you don't want to do it for very long, but it is something that you can do. It's a way of dealing with what might be considered a heat stagnation or an excessive buildup of heat in the body. So that's another way of using water to help move stagnation. And then in addition to all of those things, just a second, I want to make sure that I'm still taking a charge. It appears that I am. Okay. In addition to all of those things, of course, there are specific interventions for specific areas of the body and specific things that should be working on the inflammation or the stagnation that is not. Somebody asked, would the sheet be cold? You could start out with a warm sheet. It would get cold pretty quickly, even if you didn't. So if you have the sheet soaked in warm water and you wrap it around them, it won't be as shocking. It won't feel as bad, but it will get cold pretty quickly because it's just such a thin layer. It's not gonna feel warm on them after a moment. And I've used that technique for fevers that didn't respond to herbal and over-the-counter fever-reducing measures. And it's pretty good. A lot of the time, I like to just let fevers go, let people feel the fever, and let the fever do its work. But sometimes that's not what you want to do, especially if it's making someone very uncomfortable. So the wet sheet technique is a good thing to know about, a good old-fashioned, kind of heavy-handed thing that is an option that you can use. And especially, when you're first getting started out, it's good to have some options that are a little bit heavy-handed, some things that are not necessarily dangerous, but are maybe not the most precision tools, but something that can be used in a lot of situations. So that's something to know about. But as far as the specific interventions go, sometimes you can work on stagnation by stimulating the organs that are involved in it. So, for example, a real clear example would be that laxatives can help move food when it's not moving. When the products of digestion are not moving, there's a whole category of herbs that we use for that, bitters and laxatives, which there are a lot of. Senna is a really familiar one that maybe some of you have used before. It's the active ingredient in X-Lax is made from senna. Those senna-based laxatives are popular both as herbal and as over-the-counter drugs. They're a little bit extreme. I usually prefer not to do that when somebody's constipated, but to try instead to make sure they're getting plenty of fluids and make sure they're getting some good sources of soluble fiber that will act as a stool softener and just kind of make the actual substance softer so that it can move out of them more easily. And so things like slippery elm or oatmeal or Marshmallow are really good for that, and are kind of less intense than a stimulant laxative that's actually like senna or like aloe, that are actually going to make the muscles of the digestive system forcefully contract and push things through. You don't want to do that in any case, in my opinion, unless the person is very adequately hydrated. So, getting lots of fluid in the body is always an essential thing for dealing with stagnation. I'm going to be a little bit anxious about whether my device is going to shut down again, so I'm just kind of trying to keep an eye on that. So, besides the digestive system, if there is stagnation in the bloodstream, there are a lot of herbs that we might call blood moving herbs that are just spicy things, generally speaking, spicy or aromatic herbs that help the blood to circulate more. One that we've already talked about some is cayenne. Cayenne is a really good, and again, kind of heavy handed, but pretty safe thing that opens up blood vessels and makes blood to move when it's taken internally. And so that's something that you could often do if the circulation was not very good. Again, exercise and adequate hydration is really important in that situation too, because you want the heart to be working strongly and you want there to be plenty of fluid. If somebody doesn't have enough fluid in their bloodstream, then that's going to make it really hard for the circulation to happen in an adequate way, no matter what else is going on. With other fluid stagnation, like the lymph stagnating, for instance, sometimes, or even if there's like phlegm fluid that's accumulating in the respiratory tract, which that could also be considered another form of stagnation. Sometimes stimulating the kidneys to remove fluid from the body is helpful to that. But again, you don't want to dry the person out. You want them to stay hydrated, but just have a lot of throughput, a lot of fluid coming in and a lot of fluid going out. So there are herbs like dandelion, which we talked about in the first class. Dandelion leaf is good for stimulating the kidneys and increasing the amount of fluid that gets put through the kidneys. So that's another example of an herbal thing that you can do that is stimulating a specific organ to try and deal with stagnation. Just a second. Yeah. Okay. Someone mentioned head injury and stagnation related to that. And there could be a couple of things that go on there. There can be blood clots, there can be blood related stagnation. There can also be changes in the way that the fluid around the cerebrospinal fluid around the brain and spinal cord moves or doesn't move, because that is actually a fluid that should be in motion and should be helping with the respiration of those organs. But dealing with that is a little bit more of a sophisticated thing to deal with. But there are herbs like feverfew. That's a commonly available herb, something that you could probably buy in a place that sold herbs. Like the health food store here has it. Feverfew changes the movement of fluids in the brain, in the head, and it's used mostly to prevent migraines, which could be looked at as a form of fluid stagnation or a circulatory problem, to put it another way, that's going on inside that system of the body. So anytime that there is stagnation in the body, there is the potential for wasting of tissue and tissue death and infection. So that's a big part of why we don't want that to happen. If somebody gets an area of their body that doesn't have fluid flowing to it, it can't heal itself, And so things like what might be a shoe blister for some people would end up being a sore that doesn't heal and leads to an amputation for a person who doesn't have adequate circulation to their foot. So it's really important when you're dealing with someone's health, when you're working with someone's health, to try and make sure that there is movement of their body and of the fluids within their body, to try and prevent stagnation and try and prevent all of the things that can go wrong as a result of it. And in Chinese medicine, stagnation is called the mother of disease because it's considered to be sort of the big bad thing that underlies most diseases, is that there's a lack of movement in the tissues and energies and things that should be moving. Similarly, in Ayurveda, which is the traditional medicine of India, I don't really remember them talking about stagnation as much in the classical texts in those terms, but they talk a lot about the movement of fluids in the body, what they call rasayana. Rasa just means fluids. Rasayana is the movement of fluids, or things that cause the movement of fluids. And that's a big part of, a big underlying feature of that whole traditional medical system from India, and that thousands of years of medical thought and philosophy, is that keeping the fluids moving is what keeps people alive. And it's what, in a very extreme case, it's, what keeps people alive from one moment to the next, because you've got the air flowing in and out of their lungs. And in a more general sense, it's what keeps people healthier and younger, and makes the difference between getting old fast versus having a long, healthy life, is how well the fluids are moving throughout your body. So this is kind of a concept that has maybe come to us in as far as contemporary herbal medicine in the English-speaking world. I feel like the concept of stagnation has gotten gained a lot of currency, or gained a lot of popularity through learning from these more Eastern traditions, whereas the inflammation, that exact term came from the Romans, and then they got the ideas from some of the ideas behind it from the Greeks and the Egyptians. So it's maybe a different part of the world that this idea is coming from, but it's still very much a matter of looking at the kind of traditional four elements in the body, and looking at what the fire is doing, and what the water is doing. And so, stagnation is all about what the water is doing, what the fluid is doing in your body, and keeping that going the way that it needs to be. So as we learn more about more herbs, we'll probably be talking more about the ones that we'll be referencing this again, about how things affect stagnation, how they affect circulation. By the way, I don't know if how many people have seen this, but I went back and I added in a recipe for cayenne salve, which is for circulation, and wintergreen salve, which is for inflammation, and put them in the comments section of last week's video. So I just did that yesterday, I think. And that is there for you to check out if you get a chance to. So the two herbs that I want to talk about this week are Hawthorn and Chamomile. Hawthorn is a tree. It's usually a small tree. There's a couple hundred different species of hawthorn, and the Latin name is Crataegus. And they all have that, and then they all have a second name, which is different for all of them. And like I said, there's about 200 of them. I've used several of them, certainly not all 200 of them, but several of them medicinally. I can't tell that there's a huge difference between them. as far as, somebody asked the other day whether they were interchangeable, whether all of them were interchangeable. And I was like, well, I don't know if all of them are. I could say that the ones that I've used would include Crataegus monogyna, Crataegus oxyacantha, Crataegus douglasii, and a couple other ones. And they all seemed pretty similar to me. I couldn't really tell that one was more powerful than the other. They all taste pretty similar. They all seem like they're fairly similar medicinally to one another. So if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, which I know that most of the people on here do, then there is probably some sort of a hawthorn. Well, if you live in a temperate climate in the Northern Hemisphere and not a desert, there's probably some form of hawthorn that's native where you live. And if you live in a town, there are probably some forms of hawthorn that are grown as ornamentals where you live, because they have been popular street trees and landscaping trees. Here where I live, a lot of them are affected by a fungal disease called cedar apple rust. Cedar apple rust spends part of its life on eastern red cedar trees, maybe some other related types of trees, but around here it's mostly eastern red cedar. And then the rest of its life on apple trees and some other trees like hawthorn trees. And so that this rust gets on them. It's a little spiky fungal thing that grows on them and ruins the fruits. So there are two different medicinal components of hawthorn as well. There's flowers, leaf and flower, which is gathered in the springtime, and then there's fruit, which is gathered in the fall. Exactly when they bloom and when they fruit differs a little from species to species and is different at different latitudes as well. And it's different in different years. There are some oxyacantha hawthorns that grow in Lexington, and for years and years I harvested from them, and they were always ripe on the 21st of September. They got ripe right when the nights got to be as long as the days. And the last several years they haven't. They've got ripe way later in October. Same trees, same individual trees growing in the same place, but the weather's been different, or something, and they have gotten ripe later in the year. So much of the research that's been done on hawthorn has been done with the leaf and flower extract. A little bit has been done with the fruit extract, but not nearly as much. But both the fruit and the flower and leaf have been used traditionally. Hawthorn, a lot of people would consider hawthorn being for the heart. That's an easy way to remember what hawthorn is all about, is that it's for the heart. So physically, it will slow the beat of the heart and make it more regular. It's a very mild herb when it comes to dealing with the heart. There are much stronger herbs that will slow the heart a lot more, that will also more forcibly make the heartbeat regular, but those are not necessarily beginner level herbs. Motherwort is, but we'll talk about it later. It's kind of not necessarily one of the first herbs you want to learn, but it's a good one to learn fairly early on. But there are some stronger ones like lily of the valley, which is just like, don't even mess with them until you're more experienced with other things, because they can be poisonous and can stop the heart completely. Digitalis is another one that's very poisonous, that does the same thing. So hawthorn is kind of along the same lines as those herbs, but it's very mild, and the most that it will do is make somebody drowsy, and most of the time it won't even do that. So it's very very well tolerated, you could say, very safe. Doesn't tend to cause a lot of side effects or even undesired outcomes. Hawthorn is also along the same lines. It's calming. So, and that's, not necessarily a separate set of outcomes from what it's doing on the heart, but it's working on the emotional, the emotions that we think of as going with the heart as well. It can help a lot with anxiety. It can help to some degree with grief. That sense of feeling lost after someone has died, Hawthorn is one of the best things for that as far as herbal medicines go. So it's really traditionally thought of as mending the heart both physically and emotionally, which people didn't necessarily traditionally think of those as being separate things, but nowadays a lot of the time we would. But it's good for both sets of those things. Hawthorn is let's see, somebody asks about using it for what was it here? Could it be used for an atrial flutter that's at a normal rate with a stable person? You could try it, certainly. And it often will help with that situation. That's not necessarily the best do-it-yourself type of health situation to treat at home, but it is something that Hawthorn does help with and does have a history of being used for. So yes, although, it's important to keep an eye on that sort of thing and seek professional help if necessary. But so Hawthorn, additionally, and this is kind of getting into a little bit of esoteric territory, Hawthorn has been used a lot as a planting for hedges because it will form a nice tight hedge. It's covered in thorns. The thorns can be a couple inches thick. So if you plant a row of hawthorns along the edge of a field, it will often keep animals and passersby and so forth, large animals especially, like cows or sheep or whatever, and also people. It can act as a deterrent to them passing through an area. So it's been planted as a hedgerow in a lot of places, and it's because it will grow thickly together, and also grow, maybe 10 or 15 feet tall. It's a pretty suitable windbreak if you live in a place that's really windy. So in Ireland and in England, people would plant rows of hawthorn alongside roads and alongside fields to keep animals from wandering into their fields, to keep people maybe from trespassing as readily, and that sort of thing, and also to keep the wind from blowing away all their dirt after it's been plowed or blowing down their crops and things. So the haw part probably is an old way of saying the word hedge. So it's a very much a hedgerow plant, and because it was grown as a border plant and sort of protected the borders of fields, people thought of it as being, it has a traditional reputation as being a sort of plant that guards the border between this world and the other world, the spirit world. So a lot of the time in Irish fairy tales, there will be a hawthorn tree that's maybe a dwelling of the fairies, or a gateway, or stands in the gap of a gateway between our world and the fairy world, something like that. So it's kind of got this association of being maybe a border plant, and a border plant between fields, and also more metaphorically a border plant between worlds. So it's traditionally been thought of as a very sacred plant, and I like to treat it accordingly. I like to kind of treat it with respect. I think there have been times, even in recent years, where in Ireland they've rerouted highways to keep from cutting down hawthorn trees that had associations with fairy stories and things like that. They don't always do it that way, but sometimes they do, especially if it's pointed out to them that there's a significant association. And there are certain trees that grow by wells that people will tie little cloths to when they go to pray at the wells, because most of the wells are associated with certain saints. And I'd seen that in Ireland. And then when I went to Central Asia, I saw the same thing on hawthorn trees way up in the mountains in between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzia. So those people had the same tradition, apparently, even though it's, thousands of miles away and ostensibly very different cultures. But with some similarities. So this is, I've shown you these before. I think this is hawthorn berries, hawthorn fruits. They're kind of like tiny little apples. They're not sour like apples, but they have the same general shape. The tree looks a lot like an apple tree too, but the leaves are different. I've got to refill some hawthorn that somebody takes that they dropped a bottle off for me to refill. So that's a big part of what I do as an herbalist, is that after I've told people what herbs to use, I make up the herbs for them, and then sometimes they'll come back and refill them with me, in some cases for years and years at a time. Hawthorn is the sort of thing that you can take kind of on an ongoing basis for as long as you need to. It's not something that that it would be unsafe to take for long term. And it's also a food plant. The medicinal part of it is mild enough that it's okay to eat it as a food. It won't really usually cause problems depending on what you make out of it. I've made jellies and things out of hawthorn, usually out of hawthorn and crabapple together. They get ripe around the same time, and they make a nice combination. And they often are grown ornamentally around town, and then just kind of left to their own devices after the people who planted them forgot about them or whatever. So here in the Eastern United States, there was a tradition of making hawthorn wine. Hang on just a second. So I don't really, somebody asked if there's concern over eating the seeds of hawthorn. They're hard as a rock. I don't ever eat them. You could eat them, I suppose, but usually if I'm going to eat hawthorns off the tree, I eat them and spit the seeds out. I don't know that they're really going to contain enough of anything negative to harm somebody, rather along the same lines as apple seeds. Apple seeds contain some poisonous substance. When I try to chew up hawthorn, I can't tell that it really has that flavor of cyanogenic compounds that you can taste in apples. It may, but I haven't really noticed that it does. And I'm not sure that it would be very absorbable anyway, because the seeds are really pretty tough. But usually if I'm making food out of it, I'm kind of cooking it and cooking the pulpy part off of the seeds and then straining it out if I'm making a jelly out of it. If you're making a wine out of it, which is what I was about to talk about, you don't necessarily do that. But I don't know that much comes out of the seeds because they're pretty hard. So the Seneca made hawthorn wine, apparently probably before they were ever contacted by English-speaking or French-speaking people. And certainly shortly thereafter, the people wrote about it. And so, basically they would just mix it with water, mix the fruits with water, crush them up, get these sugars and other substances out of the fruit into the water, and then let it ferment in a closed container and make hawthorn wine, which is kind of like hard cider, or kind of like apple wine, but it's not as sweet, and it's probably got a lot of the calming effects of the Hawthorn, along with the alcohol effects of the wine. So it's a traditional strong beverage for drinking, for an intoxicant type beverage that has been used in this part of the world for a long time. I'm not sure if people in Europe made that too or not. They made wine out of a lot of different things. Mostly the people who could read and write bought their wines from France, and the peasants who made wine out of all sorts of different things didn't always write much about it. So it's not all, some of those recipes are kind of lost to changing times, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if people in Europe and people in Asia also made Hawthorn wine. So when I'm making tincture out of Hawthorn, I'll usually gather a lot of the berries, a lot of the fruits. I don't usually gather as much of the leaf and flower because it's easier to gather a pound of berries. It's pretty easy to gather a pound of berries, a pound of the fruit. A pound of the leaf and flower is a lot. It's a big physical amount of it. So I don't necessarily do it that way as much. I do usually gather some, but if you let an ounce of leaves go to fruit, an ounce of flowers turn into fruit, you'll get probably a pound or so of fruit. So to me, that feels like a more efficient way to harvest it. The neat thing about making a tincture out of the leaf and flower, though, is that the tincture turns red, just like the tincture of the berries does. The leaf is green and the flowers are white, and you would think that all the stuff that's in it would get out in a month, but it doesn't. You have to let it soak for a couple of months, 2 or 3 months in the alcohol, but it will turn usually a nice red color, even though there was nothing red in it. And that's always feels a little bit like magic. Just watching the white flowers produce even if you don't use leaves, even if you just use the white flowers, you'll still end up with a red tincture. And I don't really get where the red comes from. There has to be some sort of red substance in these white flowers that's coming out, but it's not real obvious how that happens. And also because the flowers are so thin and papery and tiny, it seems you would think that whatever is in them would be extracted fairly quickly. But with Hawthorn, that's simply not the case. And even after all these years, I don't exactly know why. Unfortunately, even though Hawthorn has had a lot of clinical trials conducted with it, not a lot of clinical trials, it's had some clinical trials conducted with it, and has a very long documented history of use going back many centuries. The exploration of what substances are in Hawthorn has been not very good and not very thorough. And I've seen some sources, but relatively few sources, talk about Hawthorn containing what are called cardiac glycosides, which are cardiac glycosides are basically steroids for your heart. They're steroidal compounds that work on the muscles of your heart and change the way that essentially change the way that potassium conducts electricity inside the muscles of your heart, for lack of a better description. So Hawthorn seems to contain some of these, at least according to some authors. But some of the other plants that contain these substances are pretty poisonous, and Hawthorn is not really poisonous in that way. So it's a very mild thing, and it might be that it contains some trace of those substances, but they're not the main thing making it work. It's hard to say for sure, but it does in any case slow and regularize the heart the way that you would expect a plant containing those substances to do. But whereas digitalis and lily of the valley will slow your heart to a stop if you take enough of them, hawthorn will barely, it will make you tired if you take enough of it, but there's actually a pretty wide therapeutic margin between the amount that starts to make your heart beat more regularly and the amount that starts to make you drowsy. So there's a pretty, it's pretty easy to take an amount that does something beneficial without causing the drowsiness if that's not what you're going for. And that's always a really good thing with herbs, especially herbs for new people, is that there's not a specific not a narrow window between not enough and too much. So you can get enough without worrying about getting too much pretty easily with hawthorn. And exactly what that is going to differ from person to person. Usually if I'm working with somebody that I want to use hawthorn to help them be more calm, more anxious, maybe not have their heart racing in response to fear or anxiety, or just wanting to have their heart beat more strongly and more regularly, then a lot of the time I would start out with 2.5 milliliters or half a teaspoon of hawthorn and work up from there. Usually you want to go up from there rather than down. There might be some people, especially if they're smaller people, for whom that might feel like too much and might make them drowsy, and you'd want to do a lower dose. But that's a good starting place is 2.5 milliliters or half a teaspoon. Question: would you say taking a dose of hawthorn tincture daily for overall health is a good idea? It's not a bad idea. It's what exactly is going to be a good idea is a little different for everybody, but for a lot of people I think that would be really good. I think that our hearts are under a lot of strain in the way that we live in the society. I think that it involves a lot of heartbreak, and it involves a lot of heart disease and a lot of stress, and I think that hawthorn can be a helpful part of dealing with all of that, and is safe enough that you don't have a lot of drawbacks from using it on a daily basis for a long period of time. So there's a question about mitral valve prolapse. It's not really not necessarily going to help with that. I mean, it might help in some way, because it is kind of just a sort of a tonic for the heart, but that's not really a condition that I would expect it to make a dramatic difference to, or an immediate difference to. So although it might ease some of the symptoms that somebody might feel from that, but I wouldn't expect it to do much, at least not directly, to correct that sort of a problem, which is sort of caused by part of the heart not having the strength, or not acting as a seal to keep fluid from flowing back the wrong direction. So yeah, that's a little bit outside of the realm of what hawthorn tends to do. But again, it might cause somebody not to feel the effects of that as much. So that's hawthorn, and the fruit and the leaf and flower. I make tinctures of both of them, but especially since we've already gone past the time period for the leaf and flower this year, at least where I live, we have. the fruit is something you might want to look out for later in the year. It's actually starting to it has fruit on it now. It's just not anywhere near fully developed or ripe yet. But if you can find hawthorn where you live, you can keep an eye on it and find out when it gets ripe where you live. There are some hawthorns growing here on Southland Drive that get ripe in October, and then the fruit persists on them until January or so before it falls on the ground. And so hawthorn fruit does go through sort of a two-stage ripening process, one of which is just it getting ripe, and then the other of which is it sort of fermenting and starting to fall off of the tree. And so the second one is called bletting. And bletting is sort of, a fermentation process that's sort of like a second ripening that some fruits go through. And especially a lot of the winter fruits around here go through it after a freeze, or they don't necessarily have to have a freeze, but there often is a freeze, which might accelerate that process because it kind of breaks up the physical consistency of the fruit a little bit. So sometimes if you get hawthorn off of the tree right after it's ripe, it's not as good or not as strong medicinally, and not as good as a food if you're trying to make a healing functional food out of it, or even just an especially calming wine. It's better if you wait until later in the season when the fruit starts to get really soft, although the birds really like it then too. So, you will be competition with them. And of course, if there's a storm or something like that, once it's gotten soft, wind shakes it down from the tree pretty easily. So you have to kind of get on it and get it pretty fast before it's too late. What do we say here? Not just a second. Oh yes. Had a comment about the hawthorn trees having Chinese lantern flies, which is an invasive insect. Haven't really, I actually haven't seen any here in Kentucky yet. They may be around, but I have not seen any so far where I live. But in Pennsylvania, they're definitely around. Some of my relatives who live up there have shown me pictures of ones that they've seen. They're neat looking bugs, but they're pretty invasive and apparently destructive as well. So
yeah, the trees are already oozing, and they like jump species of trees. Now they can eat more trees.
Oh yeah, find new ones that they like. Yeah. So yeah, hawthorn is a member of the rose family. So when you look at the flower of a hawthorn, it's going to look a lot like the flower of some apple trees, blackberry bushes, things like that. They all have the same general layout of 5 petals, and just kind of similar petal shape and everything. It's kind of built along the same lines. You also might notice that a hawthorn is a lot like a rose hip, especially if you were out with us the other day looking at the multifloral roses growing in the park, which are a very invasive species. So hawthorn doesn't tend to become very invasive, even though it is bird distributed. In our environment anyway, it doesn't tend to grow with a lot of profusion. In some places, it's more profuse. It does tend to be a long-lived tree in spite of being small, though. So you can plant a hawthorn and have it grow for hundreds of years in the same spot, and it won't even look necessarily like it's an ancient tree or anything. It'll just look like a tree a lot of the time. Some of them have really thick trunks, but a lot of them just look kind of bushy, and they have very hard wood, relatively hard wood. And the charcoal of Hawthorn was used in Ireland, and probably other places as well, for cauterizing wounds, which is not something that you necessarily want to try doing yourself. It's kind of but burning wounds to cause them to seal up and to kill infection, which is an extreme measure. Like I said, not something you want to try at home, but it is something that the plant has been used for, as well as because it has small, thin, bendy wood that is also very tough. It has been used for splints, for stabilizing bones as well, which we may do some during the weekend intensive. Towards the end of the program, we may do some. I may do a workshop about splinting injuries and how that's traditionally been done. It's not something that even in my practice that I've had a lot of call to do, really, but depending on what you were doing and what situation you found yourself in, it might be a good thing to know how to do. And hawthorn is one of the, depending on if it's growing where you are, one of the woods that can be used for that. That's pretty suitable for that. Just a second. So the question about using a hawthorn for emotional heartache, yes, that's definitely a traditional use for hawthorn, and one that I have found it to be very effective for. There are other herbs that are used for the same sort of thing, grief and loss. Holy basil is one of them. And sometimes using them both together can be a good idea too. But I have used hawthorn. I lost a very dear friend this past winter, and was feeling very I don't know, the grief was hitting me a lot harder than it has for a lot of previous losses that I've experienced in my life. And I was taking hawthorn during that time, and I do feel like it helped. I do feel like it helped to helped me to process the grief, helped the grief to not settle into my physical body and turn into a disease process, but just to remain an emotion and work its way through, and then be, I wouldn't say exactly over, but past the stage where it was a crisis. And so I do think that it can be really useful for that. So yeah, that's definitely some. Hawthorn is definitely one of the first 2 or 3 herbs that I would reach for in that sort of a situation of losing a loved one, or of having having a breakup or something like that. Well, I feel I'm pretty safe from that potential outcome myself, but it's definitely something that helps with emotional heartache, and it helps to heal the emotional heart as well as the physical heart, because it's really, grief really does affect your heart. Emotions really do affect how your heart beats. So that's that's not a wholly separate thing to talk about the heart metaphorically and emotionally, and to talk about the heart as a piece of as a cardiac muscular organ. Yeah, it's good stuff. It's one of hawthorn is one of the first herbs that I learned about, and like I said, in Irish lore, there's just so much in the tradition that I came from. There's so much magic associated with it, and so much of a sense of I don't know, such a connection to like the fairy world, the spirit world, and that sort of thing, that I really loved it because of that. I've always been interested in it, and It's a, you know, a real mild but really useful herb. So it's a really good one to learn about when you're a child or when you're getting started. It's pretty recognizable. It has a fairly distinctive leaf shape, although that differs some from species to species. And then it has the fruit that it has, which are different than, you know, there are some crab apples that look kind of similar, but they don't taste similar. And then it has thorns on it, and the thorns are pretty unmistakable. They're big, long, pointy thorns, and sometimes, you know, a few inches long. And when I was a teenager, I wore a wool shawl cloak type thing that I pinned with a hawthorn thorn, something that I made myself. My, you know, clothes making skills weren't great, but it was warm. And the hawthorn was, you know, what I pinned it with, because it was free and readily available and had a nice spooky feeling to it that I thought was interesting. So yeah, that's hawthorn. And the next herb I want to talk about is chamomile. And like hawthorn, chamomile is a bunch of different plants. There are a bunch of species of chamomile. The ones that I'm referring to right now are in the genus Matricaria. There is also Roman chamomile, which is Anthemis. It's a different genus. It's not as closely related. So I'm just talking about Matricaria species when I'm saying what I'm going to say tonight, which is, although a lot of it's true of the Roman chamomile as well, but sometimes people call it German chamomile as opposed to Roman chamomile. I just kind of think of it as regular old chamomile. This is a jar of chamomile tincture. So if you make chamomile tincture and you're using something like a 5-to-1 ratio, where you're using a gram of chamomile for every 5 grams of alcohol of liquid that you're using, or an ounce of chamomile for every 5 fluid ounces of liquid that you're using. The chamomile really takes up a lot of space and will soak up the herb, and you have to really, even to get it to be like this, where there's a little bit of space at the bottom, this is after having smushed it down with a wooden implement. So it and compressed it some, so it really will soak up pretty much all the liquid, and you'll have to wring the liquid back out of the plant material. So chamomile looks like a tiny little daisy, and the disc, the yellow part in the middle, is sort of dome shaped instead of being flat the way it is with an actual daisy. There are a number of plants that grow around here, like asters and fleabane, that look like tiny daisies, but they don't have the hemispherical, or even more elongated than hemispherical, domed disc in the center of them. They just have a flat disc, which is usually what we mean by a disc. But when you're talking about this type of plant, the yellow part of the middle of the plant, of the daisy type plant, is the disc. So chamomile has a dome-shaped disc, and it tends to be a smaller plant. It's not usually waist high. It's usually not even knee high. So it's a little plant, finely divided leaves, and then these flowers. That tincture is made out of just flowers, which is usually, if you're buying chamomile, that's usually what you get, is just the flowers. You can make medicine out of the entire above ground part of the plant, leaf and flower. And people used to, but the flower is kind of, it's more aromatic, and it's less bitter if you're making tea out of it. So as it's become more commercial, the expectation has tended to be that it's just the flowers that are being harvested and used. So that's some store-bought chamomile, or it's bought from Frontier Co-op, organic chamomile. but there is a native species. I think it's a native species. There is a wild species of chamomile that grows here, which is called Matricaria discoidea. And it doesn't really have the ray-like white petals around it, or it barely has them. They're there, but they're very tiny and greenish. So it just looks like the domed central disc, which is yellowish or greenish. And sometimes people call it pineapple weed. Matricaria discoidea is its Latin name, or Matricaria matricarioides is an older version, or not really older, but a version of its Latin name that was formerly sometimes used. So that tends to grow here in central Kentucky in sandy soil in disturbed places. So sometimes it will grow in places where there's been construction or something like that, and there's sandy soil. It likes good drainage. Sometimes it will grow in gravel driveways and things like that. I don't really like to harvest plants from driveways, but it'll grow there. And so it's a pretty common-ish weed here in central Kentucky and in a lot of other places in North America. And then its scent is a little bit different. Like I said, sometimes people call it pineapple weed. They say it has like a pineapple smell to it. I don't really get pineapple from the smell at all. It seems more like, it seems appley and fruity, maybe like the smell of apples and cherries or something like that. It has a fruity smell to it, and it has the flavor isn't fruity. It's more like chamomile, which is sort of almost like, I think chamomile tastes the way that hay smells. But chamomile is one of the most widely used therapeutic substances in the world. Millions of cups of chamomile tea a day get consumed by humans, sometimes with the express intent of being a calming thing, sometimes just that it's a pleasant beverage, but it is, it's meant to be relaxing, kind of meant to be the opposite of what caffeine is, calming rather than stimulating. And so it's a very, whereas the black tea, green tea, and coffee are more commonly consumed than chamomile tea, and they're all stimulants. But chamomile tea is more commonly consumed than most other, maybe than any other herbal tea besides those ones. And mint might be as common, but I don't even think it is. But it's it's explicitly calming rather than stimulating. Chamomile is, so it's a kind of a recreational beverage that works in the other direction without being alcohol. So it's really nice for that. And in the past, I have used chamomile for people who were trying to not consume alcohol. Chamomile tea as a mild beverage, and as just sort of like a habitual nice thing to drink instead of beer or something like that. And it can be helpful. I'm not sure how much of that is just having a substitute beverage and how much of it is having a different source of calming self-medication. But it's not nearly as strong. It tends to be very mild. If you're taking the kind of doses people take as a tea, which is like basically a spoonful or a tea bag full of actual chamomile per serving. If you are brewing chamomile, it's important not to boil it. You don't want to bring chamomile to a boil. It kind of it ruins the flavor and some of the medicine to get it that hot. So you pour hot water over it, water that's been brought to a boil and then taken off of the boil and allowed to stop boiling for a minute or so, and then poured over the chamomile. When people, yeah.
It's so funny because I had actually posted a question exactly like you just covered. I was like, why does it taste so bitter after? And I thought it was because I was steeping it too long.
Uh-huh.
But it sounds like that could also be because I'm putting it basically over just boiled hot
It
water.
could be. Steeping it too long could do it too. I mean, steeping it too long, or depending on the source of the chamomile, it might have more bitter compounds in it. Like I said, if it has leaves in it, they're more bitter than the flowers are. But yeah, overheating it can definitely make it taste more bitter as well. So
So like a
the
green tea, like kind of how I'm steeping green tea would be
yeah,
probably
yeah,
the proper way.
something more like how you would make a green tea. Um, and that's usually you don't have to steep it for very long, although you can if you want it to be more medicinal tasting, but a lot of what's in it that does what it does is going to get out in the first minute or two. um, so about what it does. Chamomile is something that we call a hypnotic sedative. It is, which sounds like it would be like a mind control thing or whatever, but it's not. It just means that it puts somebody into a regular state of sleep. So things that are not hypnotic sedatives might include valerian and opium. Valerian, and obviously opium is something where you can amputate someone's leg without waking them up, and that's very different from normal sleep, right? If you were just asleep because you'd fallen asleep and somebody came and tried to saw your leg off, you'd notice. You'd wake up probably right away. And valerian doesn't cause that depth of sedation, but the sedation that it does cause feels different than normal sleep and often involves like very vivid dreams and very vivid thought processes, even though someone is asleep. So those are both different types of sedatives. Chamomile really just sort of nudges the body towards normal sleep. And let's see. It has a bunch of different substances in it that help it to work. Some of the substances bind to an area on the surface of a nerve cell called GABA receptor, and they let's see. It's kind of similar to what I said about Hawthorn in the heart, but it's changing the way that ions are moving through the tissue. It's changing the way that electrolytes are conducting electricity in that particular type of tissue and sending a particular message. It's actually binding to the same protein that some stronger sedative drugs like Valium or Xanax would bind to. And that's important to know, because if somebody takes Valium after they've taken chamomile, it won't work as well as it's supposed to. The chamomile actually gets in the way of the stronger drug. So, because it's already attached to the place where the drug wants to attach to, or where the drug would need to attach to in order to carry out its job. So you don't want to use chamomile in someone who is already using drugs of that particular class, which would include, like I said, Valium and Xanax, and also several others, Ativan, Klonopin. There's a bunch of them. They're called benzodiazepines. So this is the first really drug interaction that we've talked about with any of these things. So a lot of people take those things for anxiety and take them for maybe even promoting sleep. They're very addictive. Withdrawal from them can be very dangerous. So a lot of people are on them as prescription medicines and sometimes not as prescription medicines. But if those people try and use chamomile, the chamomile will actually probably do less than nothing, because if those substances are already in their system and trying to work, the chamomile will get in their way and might actually have the opposite effect of making them less calmed and less sedated than they would have been with just the drug. So that's just something to be aware of. Chamomile is, really, especially if you're taking it in like a chamomile tea type of dose, which is a very small amount of chamomile, it's a very mild herb, and the sedation and the sleep aid effect is very mild. Historically, people would sometimes do things like make a quart of chamomile with ounces of, make a quart of a chamomile infusion using a few ounces of chamomile, which makes a very strong, very medicinal tasting substance, and can make someone very, very sleepy, and maybe, make them sleep for many hours together at a time. Like, 12, 18 hours of sleep from taking that large of an amount. And that is something that if you read stuff by the eclectic authors who were herbalists who were practicing in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the United States, they would sometimes use chamomile in those kinds of crazy doses. I don't really do that with it, but I sometimes use it in a stronger dose than what you would get from chamomile tea. So I'm making it in the tincture form, and then maybe using as much as a couple tablespoons of that, as much as 30 milliliters of that, which is a very strong dose, what I would consider a very strong dose of chamomile. And that's the sort of dose of chamomile and the sort of form of chamomile that I might use for someone who was very panicked, very agitated, or someone who was experiencing very severe insomnia, like if they hadn't slept in 2 days, something like that might really help to calm them off to sleep. Now, ideally with sleep, medicine to make you sleep should not be the first thing to reach for. There's a whole set of other things that you should do first before you reach for any kind of substance, herbal or otherwise, that's going to change your body chemistry. So things like having a calm, quiet, dark environment in which to sleep is really important if you can get it at all. There may be some times in life where there's just no access to such a thing, but when possible, that's really important. And might mean like saying to family members, okay, this person needs sleep and everybody needs to be quiet or stay out of that area of the house or whatever. Having a comfortable place to sleep, again, not always accessible for everybody, but when possible, it's a really important thing to have, and there's really no substitute for it. Having good sleep temperature, that's something a lot of people here are struggling with right now, because it's 90 degrees at night these last yesterday and today, and it's the first time it's been that hot this year, so a lot of people's air conditioners are struggling to keep up, things like that. So when it's too hot, that can make it hard to sleep. If it's too cold, same thing, it can be hard to sleep. So having a good sleep temperature, good sleep environment, clean bedding and a soft place to lay, all these things are really things that you should, if at all possible, deal with before reaching for an herbal sleep aid, or any other kind of sleep aid for that matter. But again, realistically, they're not always available. And so that's, as far as sleep goes, if I'm wanting to give somebody a strong something for sleep, 2 tablespoons of this kind of 5-to-1, mine's 25% alcohol. A lot of people do 50% alcohol. Chamomile tincture can be really helpful. And like I said, it tends to produce a really normal state of sleep. It doesn't tend to make people feel drugged or weird or anything like that. It makes them feel sleepy, and then they sleep, and the sleep is fairly normal sleep. If somebody needs to get up and use the bathroom and go back to sleep, they can often do that without feeling like they're stumbling around in a trance or something like that. So I have personally used chamomile to help me sleep when I was traveling and wanted to sleep. I wanted to be able to sleep on a train. Whether you feel comfortable and safe enough to sleep in that type of a situation is another question. But it's something that I have used it for in that type of situation. I've often used it with people who have come into the clinic who are in a state of distress, or who've come to me personally who are in a state of distress emotionally, and we're having a hard time calming down, or we're panicking, or that sort of thing. And it does tend to help with that. It takes a few minutes to start working, but people can usually tell a difference. And if you're giving somebody a spoonful of chamomile, it's usually calming. If you're giving them more than a couple spoonsful, it's going to probably make them want to sleep. But I've worked with a lot of people whose mental health was kind of snowballed because they were too upset to sleep, and then the lack of sleep made their brain sort of start misfiring, maybe start making them afraid of things they didn't need to be afraid of, or making them sometimes even have hallucinations and things like that. It's something you see a lot in older people, and I really love chamomile as an herb for helping older people to sleep, because a lot of the time they have a really hard time with it, either because of changing body chemistry, because of pain, or because of stress and emotional things that can come from the changes that happen as we age, losing people, changing life situations, things like that. So chamomile is very calming and relaxing. And another thing that it does, and chamomile tea is pretty helpful for this, is that it can actually help improve appetite. And it doesn't tend to make people hungry who already have a normal appetite the way that, say, cannabis does. Cannabis, people smoke marijuana and then get the munchies, right? It doesn't really do that at all, as far as I can tell. But when you have people who are either because of anxiety or because of just physical changes, don't have any appetite anymore because they just don't have a lot of digestive fire. They just don't have a lot of, they have some stagnation in their digestive system because it's not producing the juices that it did when they were younger. And so they don't have any appetite. And chamomile can really be helpful with that. Chamomile tea can especially be helpful with that because it's pleasant to drink, it's warming, and it creates enough of a change to whatever the neurology of the digestive system is that it's working on, that it makes people feel like they have an appetite. And I feel like in some cases that it's really added years to people's lives, because I've worked with people who, one case in particular, for instance, was a person who was 90 years old, and she had to move in with a daughter who was, she didn't really like the idea of moving in with somebody because she'd been living on her own since she was much younger, and didn't like the perceived loss of independence of having to move in with a family member, and had lost quite a bit of weight, and was just, not sleeping well and not eating well, seemingly just from stress. And, but also, old age playing a big role in that. And once she started taking chamomile tea twice a day, she started eating more regularly, gained back some weight that she had lost, gained back some mobility and mental clarity that seems to have declined, which is kind of hard to judge when somebody's really upset, and maybe they're just, it makes mental clarity a lot worse when you're stressed, no matter who you are. And if you've got a lot of age-related memory changes anyway, then it can be more pronounced. And the same with malnourishment. Not eating is going to make anybody weaker and less able to get up and do things. But if you're already, 90 years old, it's going to be a lot more noticeable. So in the course of just, adding in a couple of cups of chamomile tea a day, and then having more appetite and better sleep for weeks, she regained a lot of health and regained a lot of quality of life for the last few years of her life. And I've seen that with a number of people, or similar types of outcome with a number of people. So I really like chamomile as a general supportive herb for elders, because of how it affects the nervous system, which is often a big deal. A lot of people are really stressed and nervous when they're old, and it also affects the appetite and the digestion, which is similarly a big deal for a lot of people. Hang on just a second. So yeah, as far as like using it for memory changes and things like that, in elderly people, it does seem to have some help. It does seem to do some good. There are other things I use too, so I'm seldom using it alone for that, but it is often, like I said, stress affects cognitive function, and chamomile affects stress. Chamomile affects anxiety. So at a minimum, it's doing that, and I think that's really helpful. I'm not sure about using it in animals, just because I don't have that particular set of experience, but it seems like it's well tolerated enough that it would likely be worth a try. So yeah, it's really good for use in old people, and then interestingly enough, it's really good for use in small children. So children and old people are really kind of similar in some ways, but kids that don't have appetites, kids that are very anxious, I think some of it's about being vulnerable, and some of it's about not having the digestive fire that a healthy younger adult has, and that applies to children quite the same as it applies to older folks. So it's good for them too. It's good. It's safe enough as an anxiety thing to use for small children. It doesn't really have the problematic aspects that something like tobacco or cannabis for stress management would have. So it's just very mild and very well tolerated. And so if you have a lot of anxiety in children, it's really helpful for that. Difficulty sleeping, it's helpful for that. It doesn't always calm them down. Sometimes it disinhibits them and makes them feel a little bit, maybe sometimes it makes them chatty. I've seen it make kids more talkative before. I've also seen it make them not really more hyper, but just maybe more outgoing, something like that. But it tends to be really well tolerated, really mild. And again, it's something that, there's not any sort of problem with stopping it all of a sudden or anything like that. There's not like a rebound effect where when the chamomile wears off, everything comes back worse than it was before. It doesn't really do anything like that. And now I will say that with taking anything for sleep, it can become habit forming, because you get used to it being part of the process of going to sleep, and you get used to going to sleep from that chamomile induced calm state rather than the state you were in before the chamomile. So in a way, it can become habit forming in terms of just more like a psychological dependence on it, but not really a chemical dependency the way that you would get from a benzodiazepine, even though it's kind of working on the same parts of the nervous system. So it can be helpful for that. If you read anything about chamomile that was written from about, I don't know, mostly in the 80s and 90s, a lot of things carried this particular disclaimer, but a lot of things would say that if you're allergic to ragweed, you'll be allergic to chamomile, or you're more likely to be allergic to chamomile, or something like that. And the supposed rationale behind it is that chamomile and ragweed are part of the same plant family. But a lot of things are part of that plant family. It's a very large plant family. It also includes sunflowers, artichokes, lettuce. So, you know, it's a huge plant family. It contains a lot of plants that people eat regularly. If you're allergic to ragweed, there's higher than average chance that you're a particularly allergic individual who might be allergic to a lot of things. But there's no real evidence of any specific cross sensitivity between chamomile and ragweed, which a lot of older, or not that old, but a lot of writing about herbal medicine might lead you to believe that there was, because it was just something that somebody said and it caught on. It sounded like it made sense, and so a lot of people repeated it, but there's really not much to it, you know, other than the fact that, as I said, you know, people can be allergic to a lot of things, and if you're a very allergic individual, you're probably allergic to ragweed and maybe lots of other stuff. So not that many people are allergic to chamomile. I think that there's only been one recorded case that I've ever seen of a severe allergic reaction to chamomile, whereas, you know, common food plants like peanuts have allergic reactions to them as a very common thing, or not just peanuts. That's kind of a harsh, extreme example, but all sorts of common foods have a lot of people that are allergic to them. Chamomile has relatively few people that are allergic to it. And it does contain some antihistamine substances. So for some people, chamomile can actually help to reduce the allergies that they might be experiencing from other things. And it also, you know, causes drowsiness, rather like some of the old-fashioned antihistamines did. And so it's, you know, sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes you want something that will make it easier to sleep, even though you've got hay fever or something like that. So chamomile is not necessarily my first choice as an antihistamine, but it is one, and it is one that some people use for that purpose. So yeah, chamomile is a really good herb to know about. Tea form is good. Tincture form is another form that I use it in a lot. There are topical forms of chamomile as well. Using the actual same tea type form of chamomile as a wash on the skin can help with a lot of types of itching. It actually calms the nerves without numbing the skin. And so it can reduce how itchy certain things feel, especially if someone has itchy scalp with dandruff or something like that. It works a little bit on poison ivy, but there are other things that work better. But it does help some with that. Eczema. So a lot of the time, if there's just irritated, inflamed, itchiness of the skin, washing it with chamomile can help. The chamomile wash has also been used for hair to supposedly to help it grow, and also to just kind of help it be healthier, kind of make it not break as easily. I'm not sure how well that works. I've messed around with it a little bit, but not enough. It's not something that people usually come to me for, so I haven't really used it on like a professional scale or whatever. I've just kind of played around with it a little bit, but it's something that I might use in that type of situation if it were to come up. And that's just, you know, a strong infusion of the chamomile, maybe soaked in water, warm water, and then allowed to steep until it was cool, and then applied to the skin. And it, you know, wouldn't matter so much that it tasted bitter, because you wouldn't be tasting. So yeah, chamomile is a plant with a lot of different uses that all kind of tie together in some ways, but are kind of distinct from each other in some ways too. Somebody asked, how is chamomile for dental sensitivity? I haven't really tried it for that. It might help some. I wouldn't be surprised if it helps some. I usually use an oil extract of usnea. I used to use prickly ash bark, either as a tea or an extract, for sensitive teeth. Although that works pretty well, but I don't really use it as much anymore because the chamomile, the usnea oil seems to work better for that. Chamomile has also been used as something to help get rid of topical parasites like lice and mites. That's also not something that I have to deal with a lot in my practice. Usually, if I do use it for that, which I used to work at the sort of medical tent at rainbow gatherings, which often involved lice. There were often or sometimes outbreaks of lice. I would use chamomile and pennyroyal together topically and put that in people's hair and then comb their hair out and get the nits out of it, which is kind of the real work, the hard work. But it helps with the itching, like I said, and it also helps to kill off the parasites themselves, the biting insects and arachnids and things that might be on the surface of the skin or on the hair. So that's another use to be aware of for it. So, anybody have any questions about either of these herbs? You tincture the thorns of hawthorn. I do not tincture the thorns of hawthorn. I don't know what that would be like. Someone might do that though. I have not encountered that as a medicine. Just the leaf and flower, and then the fruit separately. Leaf and flower in the early spring and fruit in the late fall or early winter. Just a second. Okay, and then everybody feel like you get the just a second. If I were using the chamomile as a wash for mites, I would usually use it. I would just make a strong tea of the chamomile, like maybe infusing it for infusing it until the boiled water gets cools to room temperature, and then wringing it out. If you take chamomile and strain it through a cloth and then you wring it out, you'll get a sort of substance that comes out of it that's a little bit emollient, a little bit slippery, slightly slimy, gives a thick body to the chamomile infusion. And then I would just use that straight. I would pour it on and maybe comb it through if it was, on hair, and then leave it there for several minutes and then wash it off. Yeah, so I mentioned a 5-to-1 ratio with 25% alcohol for chamomile, and it's basically, that's kind of what I use as sort of my go-to ratio for tincturing. And so that you would use something pretty similar for hawthorn, yes. And like I said, with chamomile, if you're tincturing it, you really do need to strain it and squeeze it and press the liquid out of it, because the chamomile flowers are very absorbent and they will soak up pretty much all of the liquid. If you use a 5-to-1 ratio, they'll pretty much soak it all up and you'll have to squeeze it all back out. and you'll never get it all back out. But every bit that you get out, you'll have to squeeze back out. So it's important to realize that it is going to soak up the liquid. And so if you're doing a tincture by maceration, which is the only kind we've really talked about so far, it will take some pressing it out at the end. With Hawthorn, it won't really take so much pressing it out because the fruits they'll already contain some liquid, and they've kind of got a distinct inside and outside. They're not really absorbent the way that the flowers are. So they don't soak stuff up so much. They would some if you use dried ones. Again, it would make sense to kind of press it out of them, squeeze it out. But yeah, with the infusion for using it on the surface for mites or whatever, I would just, apply it and let it soak in and stay there till dry or so, and then wash it out maybe with some shampoo or something or soap. Yeah. All right. Oh, good. Glad to hear that somebody says they made a really good tasting cup of chamomile tea. So I'm glad that works out. And yeah, it can be a very enjoyable beverage. It can be a very pleasant thing to have. And, in addition to its medicinal and health benefits. So it's a really good herb to know about. And it's not one that grows wild a lot in most places, but it's an easy one to cultivate if you decide to grow it. And there are some wild chamomiles in some places as well. All right. Any other questions about that? Can people be allergic to hawthorn? I can't think of ever having seen a hawthorn allergy in the decades that I've been using it, but people can be allergic to just about anything. So I wouldn't say no, but I would say that it is pretty unusual, pretty uncommon to come across. Yeah. So between now and next time, I'm just going to make probably a short video that I will tell you about when it's up, just talking about the plant collection process with some written instructions and everything like that, so that everybody can be working on that project. I figure, if you are working on that now, if you're done with that by 6 months into the course, that will be winter here, or that will be November here. And so that would be a good time to aim for as far as being done with making your plant collection. And I know that some of you have already talked to me about working on it, and that's great. And if you are not already working on it, then you'll miss certain species that are blooming now. So, if possible, try and spend a little time each week looking at what's growing around you and what's blooming around you, so that you can start familiarizing yourself with the yearly cycles of the plants where you live. And 5 years from now, you'll be really used to what blooms when and everything like that. And you'll be much more in tune with the land around you. But it takes a little bit of working up to that. But making the plant collection is a really good step in that direction, a really good process to go through to try and help familiarize yourself and get on the same page with the plants where you live. So I will make that up, and when that's made up, I will let everybody know that it's going to be. I'll post it to the same YouTube channel, and it'll probably just be a very short thing. All right, and thanks again to everybody who made their contribution for this month. I greatly appreciate it. And If anybody thinks of any additional questions, let me know, and I will try to get back with you as soon as I can. And my hope is to get this video uploaded tonight or tomorrow. And thanks for bearing with me during my technical difficulties earlier.
Bye, good night.
Good night. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.